Hello, and welcome to another episode of George Reviews. In this episode, we'll be talking about a film, First Reformed, written and directed by Paul Schrader, starring Ethan Hawke and Amanda Seyfriend.
For you, every hour is the darkest hour.
Can God forgive us for what we've done to this world? You believe in martyrdom, Reverend?
Hope and despair. A life without despair is a life without hope. Holding these two ideas in our head is life itself.
First Reformed was a film that came out in 2018, and I feel it's very unrecognized and underrated upon its initial release. Released by everyone's favorite hipster art house film distribution company, A24. And A24 has distributed a lot of great cinematic wonders over the past decade. They've really stepped up to the plate. But with First Reformed, I just feel it didn't receive as much acclaim and recognized attention compared to the likes of Lady Bird, Hereditary, or The Lighthouse. The film follows the character of Reverend Toller, played to perfection by Ethan Hawke. He is a broken man tortured by his past, the death of his son, as well as suffering from what appears to be stomach cancer, and he has drifted far away from his faith. He is the pastor at a historic church called First Reformed, and his help is sought by a pregnant parishioner, Mary, played by Amanda Seyfriend, for counseling her husband, Michael, who is a radical environmental extremist, which plagues Toller in his mind and in his faith. And it's such a riveting and thought-provoking character study about this man who's struggling between his faith, the outside world of organized religion, and the temptation of radical extremism. And I just love the fanatical parallels this film presents between faith and extremism. Like I said, the film was written and directed by the legendary Paul Schrader, who is most well known for his great, groundbreaking writing collaborations with Martin Scorsese on such films like Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The Last Temptation of Christ, and Bringing Out the Dead, starring the legendary Nicolas Cage. Schrader is really well known for exploring these really gritty, dark, ambiguous character studies, taking the characters through a spiritual and existential crisis. A spiritual film was something Paul Schrader swore he would never make, and that was the inspiration of that resistance, which plays a vital role in the tone and pacing of First Reformed.
I had, as a young man, as a film critic, written about spiritual films, but claimed that I would never make one. It wasn't me. It wasn't what I wanted to do. I liked those films, but I didn't want to make one. And then about 3 years ago, after a conversation, I said, it's time now. You're going to be 70 next year. It's time to write a spiritual script.
I really love the concept of having a protagonist struggle with their belief in God and faith in God. Not having their religious bias as a crutch that defines their character. I'm talking about you, Pure Flicks. But to have an actual struggle through their belief, and First Reformed very much fills that definition. I love it when a film really builds up and resonates with you in a very visual way that gets under your skin in an uncomfortable but enthralling way, and that is my biggest takeaway from First Reformed. There's a lot of power in the presentation of this film that is very much a slow burn, and it uses its slow, methodical pacing to its advantage that builds up a lot of tension as it leads the character of Toller through a very dark, self-destructive path. And I grew more and more intrigued and curious as the film went along to see how far they would take him, and Schrader really takes you on his character journey that is very subdued and agonizing, but in a good way. But there's something about it that really grows on you and through you in pinpointing the many brilliant subtleties Schrader presents within this character. Needless to say, I really, truly love this film. It just has such an amazing effect on me. I've connected with it on multiple rewatches, and I wasn't really sure how I felt about it in my initial viewing back in 2018, but I did know that this was a very unique piece of cinema. The script is immaculate and restrained. Every moment of dialogue and silence is so purposeful to really dive into the mind and motivations of Toller. The moments of silence we find Toller in, the expressions and many other nuances combined with the writing and Hawke's performance reveal this character who is becoming susceptible to this toxic possession of extremism. This is hands down one of the most profound and monumental performances by Ethan Hawke. I feel this was one of the most important roles of his career, as Hawke once considered becoming a priest. It is only rivaled by his performances in Gattaca and Tape for me. Ethan Hawke has always been a very interesting actor that really goes all in with this intense presence and dedication he brings to his performances. An actor who really cherishes the important relationship and dynamic with a great director. His performance and role is very restrained and visual and nuanced. He has to convey so much emphasis on slight movement movements and body language that he 100% excels at in this role. He is the type of protagonist that we don't necessarily need to be in love with or relate to, but one that's intriguing and mysterious to the things that are happening in his mind and the morality of his soul. Amanda Seyfriend is very wonderful in the supporting role of Mary and plays off Ethan Hawke very well. They have a really friendly chemistry, not to mention a surprising supporting performance by Cedric, famously known as Cedric the Entertainer, who's also more restrained than we are used to seeing him, and his performances with Hawke were among some of my favorites. Victoria Hill, The Leftovers' Michael Gaston, and Philip Ettinger also bring in mesmerizing supporting performances. The cast is amazing all around. The shot composition and cinematography is well executed. It is not so much show-offy or stylized or grandiose in the traditional sense. The shots really create this tense stillness that the characters are in, which is complemented by the 1:37 aspect ratio that gives a very claustrophobic effect. At first I wasn't sure why the film was in this aspect ratio and thought it was just a trend, as many films, especially from A24, have played around with aspect ratios, some for specific artistic choice and others that just leave me bewildered. So on subsequent rewatches, I've grown to really appreciate the effect the cinematography and aspect ratio displayed in the presentation of the film. The shots also really stay on the characters. Most of it is static, but elevates the stillness of the emotional state of Toller as well as some of the other characters and complements the film very well. The film knows when to really restrain itself and when to reveal certain information through visual movement. The cinematography chooses wisely when to move in, when to pull in closer. It's very subtle and calculated. The color palette is muted and diluted, but creates this really vivid detail in the design and look of the characters and really conveys the polluted and decayed state Toller is in. Stillness is key in this film, from the style of the shot composition and aspect ratio to internalizing Toller's motives as a character are really reflective of that stillness and the anticipation of action or decision. The lack of music and traditional score is brilliantly purposeful throughout the film, so you really internalize the inner conflict and turmoil that is manifesting within Toller. With using silence to its advantage, it does carry little moments of a low-tone ambient score that reflects the poisonous influence overtaking his mind and faith. It chooses wisely almost as a motif to certain sequences of the film. It's not really a score in the traditional sense, but a very low-bearing, ominous soundscape, almost as if it's echoing in the empty void of our main character. My criticisms are very few. I have very little negative things to say about First Reformed. To me, it is almost a perfect film. And having watched the film 4 times now, I'm not really sure I can hold any initial criticisms I had on my first viewing of the film. I do feel there are moments that the film verges on the line of obvious in a few instances. I've thought about the film's bias from the environmental angle that is presented in the story and what that says about radical environmental extremism. And yet it really does not hold that in a very positive light, as it gets construed with radical terrorism against the corruption of organized religion through Toller's warped perception. It gets its message across of the dire state of the planet from a spiritual point of view in a way that is not talking down to the audience. Still, there are some scenes where it hinges and borderlines on obvious, but it overall works in the film's favor, and any political message isn't force-feeding the viewer, but more conveying through the character's point of view. Another point is the ending, which I'll be getting into with the spoiler section, so if you've not yet seen First Reformed and do not want to be spoiled, skip to this time code where I'll be giving my concluding thoughts on this review. That's your warning. 3, 2, 1. Now let's go more in depth into the character of Reverend Toller, some of the scenes in the film, as well as the ending and my interpretation. To really get in depth about Toller and his character journey throughout the film, it's very important to highlight a few things. We first find him in his residence within the church. It is bare and minimalist, displayed by the amazing production design of Grace Yun. This tells you everything we need to know about his character and the detached state he is in with his faith in the outside world. We get some insight into his mental state through his journal entries that give you the sense that he's drifting from a former life. That he's not just going on with himself despite tragedy and the inability to persevere from those tragedies of his life. Hawke does a really amazing job in his performance of reading the entries through voiceover that conveys a passive sadness in his vulnerability. We get our first glimpse into his descent into extremism and the interaction with the character of Michael. Michael sees the toxicity and corruption in nature and the world, which influences Toller as he adopts his ideology, as he grapples to sustain his faith within this environment, as Michael struggles with any hope of the survival of humanity in the world. It is that transference that occurs after Toller discovers Michael's dead body by suicide. Toller's faith becomes distorted and self-deceptive that slowly unravels him. He continuously drifts into a more toxic and extreme ideology of the state of the environment and the planet as Michael's fears project through Toller, that is overtaking him in fear and pushing him to take drastic action.
Can God forgive us for what we've done to this world.
Who can know the mind of God?
Will God forgive us for what we're doing to his creation? That's what Medsana asked me when I visited him.
You know the mind of God? You spoke to him personally?
Before Michael's suicide, Mary finds a suicide bomb vest that was crafted by him, which Toller takes possession of. Toller is taunted by this vest, as if it were luring and seducing this darkness that has been creeping beneath him. Now he has this tool of destruction, something viable that he can use in his self-righteous sacrifice. These scenes are filled with the low-tone ambient soundscape that convey this downward spiral Toller is succumbing to visually. The institution of organized religion and the infection of big industry corrupting that institution makes him sick and is isolating himself from his hope and his faith in God. This extreme radicalization of Toller's mind causes him to drift further from that faith that he's grown so apathetic towards. It shifts into a different path. The change in Toller's direction as a character is very subtle and steers in a very cold and cruel manner. We see him slowly embrace this darkness that is poisoning his thoughts and morality. He is a very detached character at the beginning, and he goes further down into that darkness and detachment to where we are recognizing him as something else. He becomes more comfortable in the idea of sacrificing himself to a higher purpose and some kind of demented perception of a greater good, as if he was a martyr to his own faith. And I really love how Schrader executes Toller's crossover from detached faith to this martyrdom complex. Let's talk about Mary and the levitation scene. To me, Mary represents the light and goodness of what Toller used to know of his faith in God and his image of hope as she is with child. We see through this scene a lot of that beauty and hope he sees through her, but his mind is corrupted by these doom and gloom thoughts of what is causing suffering on the planet that is represented through God's image to Toller, and what little piece of his faith that she represents cannot rise above the poison of this extremism that has overtaken him. This sequence visually represents his state of mind, and the fears that Michael had have now become Toller's. Toller becomes so fanatical in this radical extremism ideology so he can easily justify violence and death in the name of this altered faith from his own that he has adopted. Now let's get into the ending. To set this up, we see that Toller is ready to arm himself in a suicide bomb vest for the 250th reconsecration ceremony at the First Reformed Church. He is ready to commit to this act of violence inside the church against the character of Bulk, who really represents the corruption of religion and threat to the environment to Toller. But when Mary shows up, his plan breaks down and forces him to self-inflict and commit suicide by Drano. He cannot fathom the thought of being responsible for the murder of an unborn child. And after this build-up, it's really tricky into what actually happens. As he is about to engulf the Drano from a glass, we see Mary standing before him as he runs towards her as the two share a loving kiss and embrace, until the film hard cuts to black and we are left in the end credits. On a surface level, this took me out of the film a bit. It didn't really feel right, but the more I dug into commentaries and interviews with Schrader, I was able to come to my own interpretation and conclusion. Schrader has stated he doesn't know what really happens in the end, but gives two possibilities.
Is Reverend Toller alive or dead at this point? I don't know. You can make a case for both. Maybe love has saved the day. Or maybe this is an ecstatic vision of a man who is on all fours dying while he pukes out his stomach. Which is not necessarily a sad ending either. So it's a choice of two happy endings.
Here's my breakdown of the ending. I believe that Mary didn't actually physically come to him, but she was his image of salvation in his final moments. Just looking at her in the background with the light surrounding her is almost like she is an angel. Mary is the embodiment of hope for Toller. She is what he held onto to come to peace with himself, and that he did drink the Drano and commit suicide. A couple of factors play into this. We see the doors locked to his adjacent residence next to the church. We see Jeffers trying to open the door when he's looking for Toller, and we don't even see Mary actually leave her seat, so there's no possible way she could have opened the door unless she had a key, which really wouldn't make much sense. It is a bittersweet and somewhat hopeful but devastating end to the film. Throughout the film, Toller is going through an existential crisis of faith and is pulled into this extremism as a way to reevaluate and revitalize that faith and belief as an excuse to go into this downward spiral of a self-destructive sacrificial act. He becomes intense on it and he succeeds in that sacrifice of himself, and at the same time becomes reunited with that faith and hope in the image of Mary. I took the ending as more of a metaphor and delusion and an image of what peace is and what heaven and serenity is to Toller. It is very tragically bittersweet, and Schrader executes executes this in the ending very subtly and very interpretable. It even relates back to Toller's conversation with Michael about hope and despair, that you cannot exist in one without the other. It is portrayed as a somewhat simple happy ending, but there's this implication with how the film cuts to black, with the soundscapes echoing in the end credits. The hard cut really reminded me of the ending of The Sopranos and the implications and theories that ending has had in over a decade. It is a very haunting way to end the film, thrusting a sweet and beautiful image of hope to a black, endless void of uncertainty.
Hope and despair. A life without despair is a life without hope. Holding these two ideas in our head is life itself.
Hope and despair, portrayed at the very end of the film. But that's what I'm taking from the ending and from Schrader's commentary. To me, the film really represents when a person is lost from their faith, their morality, or idealism. They become very prone to toxic influence and extremism, and that goes beyond any spiritual belief of God and religion. The film for me sparked a lot of provoking thought that I really grappled with on a subconscious level from my first viewing of the film. Schrader really crafted a profound and devastating character study, something that I'm sure was very close to him. You can really get a sense of that in the restraint and execution in the filmmaking. I feel First Reformed is a very important film, and one that should not be overlooked, and stands just as profound and important as Taxi Driver. I hope people will really give this film a chance and give it the attention and recognition it so very much deserves. Watch it on Amazon Prime, buy it on Blu-ray, even for the fantastic Schrader commentary. This is certainly a film I will never stop thinking about, and I'm going to give First Reformed 4.5 stars. And that's going to do it for my review for First Reformed. So what did you think about First Reformed? Did you love it? Did you do anything for you? Did you hate it? If so, what the fuck is wrong with you? I'm just kidding, but hey, let me know either way down there in the comments. Please like and subscribe if you be so kind. My name is George Ray. I want to thank you here for tuning into this review. Please remember to keep calm, keep cool, and embrace great cinema, and I'll see you on the next one.